Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Natalia Leigh. I'm an indie author and freelance editor, and today I am sharing my top 7 tips for writing stronger dialogue. I think dialogue is one of those things that you either struggle with when you first start writing or you're just naturally really gifted at it. There are some people who just pick up on dialogue really fast. And if you're not one of those people and you want to kind of put some more tools in your tool belt and learn how to write stronger and more impactful dialogue, then this video is for you. Let's get started. All right, my first tip is to use contractions because they sound so much more casual and natural in everyday conversation. Most of us don't walk around speaking formally to one another. Even in some formal settings, people use contractions. That's just natural within dialogue. If you don't know what a contraction is, it's essentially 2 words squished together like it is become it's, do not becomes don't, she is becomes she's, so those are contractions. So when I say use contractions in your dialogue to make it sound more casual and natural, that's what I mean. My second tip, and I have mentioned this on my channel quite a few times, is to read your dialogue out loud or have somebody else read it to you. You can either ask, somebody at home to read it to you, or I know that you can program it into a text-to-speech program or function. I've not used that personally, but I know of people who have. So by reading your dialogue out loud or having it read back to you, it feels very different than reading it in your head. And I find that that's a really good way to pick up on whether or not something sounds natural, whether or not it sounds like something people would actually say to one another. And again, if you're not using contractions and everything sounds really stiff and formal, you're going to catch that when you're reading it out loud or when it's being read back to you. So, especially if you're like, oh, I'm doing the best I can with this dialogue, but I'm not sure how it's coming across to readers, read it out loud or have somebody read it to you. My third tip, this one is going to be a little bit more difficult because it takes more attention. It's a little bit more difficult, a little bit more tedious, and that is to cut the small talk and make sure that your dialogue is impactful and it kind of moves the story forward. So, Mew is up on my desk now. Hi, darling. So when I say cut the small talk, I mean, we don't need to hear your characters talking about the weather unless the weather is imperative to talk about in that moment, unless the weather, gives us foreshadowing or moves the story forward in some way. We don't need to hear people just chatting and catching up like, you and I might if we saw somebody at the grocery store or something like that. Storytelling is different than just everyday living. So I do say that you want your dialogue to sound as natural as possible, but then there's an additional layer to that, which means that your characters aren't just going to be having meaningless small talk conversations because it's boring for the reader and it wastes their time, it wastes your character's time, and it wastes valuable real estate in your novel and on the page. So if you have a bunch of dialogue that doesn't do anything and doesn't take us anywhere, then cut it out and either replace it with something more impactful or just get rid of it and move the story forward. Okay, tip number 4 builds off the last one, and this is not something that you can directly say, oh, I'm gonna add this to my dialogue, but it's something to keep in mind while you're writing, and that is that when I personally am writing or when I am editing for a client, I'm thinking, okay, every single line in this book is building, right? We're kind of building from the foundation up, and everything in that book needs to build the story, and it needs to either progress the story forward or help progress relationships within the story, which is progressing the story forward. So every line of dialogue needs to have a purpose and it needs to do something. If you find that your lines of dialogue are just running around in circles, they're not doing anything, they're not pushing the characters forward, they're not further developing relationships, they're not furthering the plot, if they're doing nothing and they really have no purpose there, then you need to get rid of them. And this, I would say, is a little bit more advanced. So if you're somebody who has had some practice in storytelling and has had practice in writing a lot of dialogue, then this might be a good tip for you, is just to think that every single sentence you put down in your book needs to build off of the previous sentence and all of the sentences that came before it, because you are consistently building and building and building this story to get to the end. And whether it's a line of dialogue or a description or an action, like whatever it is, maybe it's an entire scene, if it doesn't push the story forward, if it doesn't push the characters to grow and develop, then it needs to be cut out and just get rid of it, either get rid of it or make it impactful and make it important for some reason. So just keep in mind, dialogue is always building on the story that you've already laid the foundation for earlier on in the novel. All right, tip number 5 is to consider how people actually speak and consider how your characters would actually speak. So I can use my book, Pistol Daisy, as an example of this. Pistol Daisy takes place in the Wild West in 1880 in like the dusty plains of Colorado. So the people back in 1880 in the Wild West spoke very differently than most people do now. They spoke in kind of a lazy Western slang, lots of shortened words and lots of contractions. And on top of that, they also didn't use all the words we use now. Something I really love doing is kind of looking into the history of words, and if I have a word in a line of dialogue that feels a little bit too modern to me, you know, when I was writing Pistol Daisy or now as I am working on Whiskey City for Camp NaNoWriMo, if I come across a word that feels too modern, especially in dialogue, I like to look up that word and look up the history of it and when it was known to come into use. So I go so far as trying to only use words in dialogue that actually existed back during the 1880s in this historical time period. So really consider how your characters would realistically speak. Now, earlier on I said use contractions because it sounds more natural. I'm going to come back on that a little bit and also say, you know, maybe you're writing a historical fiction about, you know, queens and kings and royalty and nobility. Maybe those people didn't speak with as many contractions. Maybe they spoke much more formally. They had a more rigid and like stiff manner in terms of how they conversed with one another. That would be absolutely okay to convey through your dialogue if you're writing in that type of historical time period. Now, maybe you're not writing in a historical time period, maybe you're writing about right now, the crazy year of 2020. But even if that's the case, people in different parts of the world speak differently and they use different words. I have really picked up on this now that I am editing so frequently. I'm actually editing a lot of novels written by people who live in the UK or live in different parts of the world, and I'm noticing that we use different terms for the same exact thing, or we word things a little bit differently. And to me, it's fascinating to learn how, even right now in this day and age, people all over the world are speaking about the same things in very different ways, using different words and different phrases. So, if you're writing maybe about a place or a time period that you don't live in, that you've never lived through, do your research on it, and I really think it'll help bring your story to life and bring your dialogue to life when your readers feel like you are conveying the characters in the most realistic and authentic way possible. Okay, tip number 6 is going to be a really basic one, but this is something that we all have to learn, and that is when a new character is speaking. So let's say you have a few people talking back and forth. Whenever a new speaker is introduced, you're going to need to start a new paragraph. That paragraph needs to be indented, and that shows readers that somebody new is speaking. And I actually did an entire video on tips for punctuating dialogue because I know it can get tricky and there are some like little rules and little things that you need to do or that your editor needs to do that you might not know about. So if you need some additional tips on punctuating dialogue, that video will be linked down below. I highly recommend watching this one and the punctuating dialogue video, because then I think you'll feel really confident writing dialogue from this point forward. Or if you just want a couple more tips, make sure to check out that video. But yes, every time a new speaker is introduced, a new person is talking, make sure you're starting it out on a new indented paragraph. Otherwise, your readers are going to get incredibly confused. Okay, so the last tip of the day, tip number 7, is to use very simple dialogue tags. And I see okay, let's start with what a dialogue tag is. The weather is very nice outside, Natalia said. That right there is your dialogue tag. It essentially follows dialogue, or sometimes it comes before dialogue, and it tells the reader who is saying that line of dialogue. Now, I often see, especially with new writers, people who are just starting out with the craft of storytelling, I see a lot of dialogue tags that are incredibly expressive. He laughed, he growled, he whispered, I can't even think of others, but there are so many. Essentially, you know, people using more descriptive verbs for how their characters are saying something, and that's okay every so often. You know, if you need to really convey emotion or really convey drama or something that's happening in a scene, it's all good to use those more expressive dialogue tags, but in general, I would say keep it incredibly simple. You know, keep it to like said or asked. Those are like the most common that I see. Blah, 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 so-and-so said, blah, 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 so-and-so asked. Like, those are so simple and so to the point that they almost become like white noise to your readers, which is okay. Readers are going to read your line of dialogue. They're going to skim over your dialogue real quick just to, you know who's speaking, and they're going to move on. But if you're using really complex and descriptive dialogue tags after every single line of dialogue, it gets really tiring to the readers, and it does feel a little bit amateur. You don't need to use super expressive dialogue tags all the time. And going along with that, if you have, let's say you have two people talking and they're speaking to one another back and forth, once your reader picks up on that rhythm and that pattern and repetition, how the dialogue is going, you don't need to use a dialogue tag every single time. You can use one every so often just to remind the reader who is speaking, but you don't need a dialogue tag after every single line of dialogue. And something else you can do if you feel like, oh my gosh, I've used so many dialogue tags, so many like he said, she said, I need to do something else, you can use an action instead. Now, I picked up Pistol Daisy, I kind of went through here real quick, and I found a super simple like example of this, so I'm going to read it to you. One of these has a dialogue tag, and then the other line of dialogue uses action to kind of show the character who is speaking. So here it goes. Where were you coming from? I asked Tommy. So you have your dialogue tag there. East. He runs a finger along the rim of his shot glass. Grew up in Pennsylvania. So the very first line of dialogue, where were you coming from? I asked Tommy, is followed up by that dialogue tag, so it shows us, okay, Daisy, who is the main character, it's her story and she's telling it in first person, she's the one who spoke that. But then instead of saying east, Tommy said, instead of just, following it up with another dialogue tag, I used an action. East. He runs a finger along the rim of his shot glass. Grew up in Pennsylvania. So I am showing the reader who is speaking by showing them that small action of Tommy running his finger along the rim of his shot glass. So this is something that you can definitely play around with. If you are using a lot of dialogue tags and you're finding that they're just becoming a little bit overwhelming, you can absolutely simplify them or cut them out when the pattern and the rhythm of speaking is super clear to the reader, or use an action instead to kind of break up the monotony of he said, she said, he said, she said. Thank you, Pistol Daisy, for explaining this for me. And I could go so much deeper into a lot of these topics. I have so much to say on the topics of dialogue, storytelling, show versus tell, descriptive language, everything. I do like to keep it to some like basic tips because I think everybody could use basic tips. But if you want some more of like a deep dive into dialogue, punctuation, any sort of like editing content, please let me know in the comments down below. I do keep like a large running list of all the videos I want to film, and I am always taking requests and suggestions. Going along with that, I am, like I said at the beginning of the video, a freelance editor. I do content editing, copy editing, and proofreading. I can edit your synopsis, I can edit your query letter, I can edit the blurb for the back of your book, I can edit almost anything you send me, depending on the genre, if you're looking for more of a content edit. So make sure to come visit me at enchantedinkpublishing.com. We also offer book design / formatting, and I will link this down below as well. I do have a video about like how to do basic book formatting in Word, because I know a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people write their books in Word, and you can format a book in Word. It's a little bit tricky, but I do have a video on that down below if you're interested, or if you're looking for somebody to format your book for you, again, come visit us at enchantedinkpublishing.com. Okay guys, I need to get back to my clients and my edits for the day. It was wonderful sitting down and chatting with you about dialogue, and I will be back next week, hopefully with another tips video, maybe a Camp NaNoWriMo vlog, maybe like an office redecorating, remodel, because I'm working on that today as well. But have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!